Ladies and gentlemen, members of the diplomatic community, executive directors of the board of the African Development Bank Group, delegates from around the world, and delegates here in our headquarters studio in Abidjan, welcome, bienvenue, and bonjour. Welcome to the launch of the African Development Bank Group's 2023 Africa Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. Now, I don't know about you, but we're certainly off to a very fast and furious start to what promises to be a dynamic year. I guess that it's still not too late to wish you, our guests, and those of you in the audience here, and delegates, a happy new year. So a happy new year to you all. Well, that doesn't sound too encouraging. A happy new year to you. Could you please say a happy new year to the person to your left and to your right? That's more like it. Now let's get into the spirit. My name is Victor Oladokun. It's my pleasure to be your moderator today. This is a hybrid event with a live audience here in Abidjan and a global online audience from across Africa and other parts of the world. We're particularly appreciative of our guests joining us from Asia, where they're on average about 9 hours ahead of us, and North America, where it is actually still the crack of dawn. Once again, welcome. Now, just to give you a quick overview of the program, we'll be joined by several distinguished global and regional economic, finance, and development experts who will share thoughts and insights about the year ahead. Also, we're going to have a very, very insightful panel discussion featuring Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, renowned economist Professor Jeffrey Sachs, who will be joining us virtually from New York, and Her Excellency, Mrs. Niali Kaba, the Ivorian Minister of Planning and Development. Panelists will have an opportunity to provide key takeaways from the Macroeconomic Outlook and Performance Report and look into the proverbial crystal ball to give us an idea and a sense of what lies ahead over the next 11 and a half months. This will be followed by a facilitated discussion from delegates in attendance. There will also be a public unveiling of the report, following which delegates, guests, the public and the media will have an opportunity to access the document electronically, either by clicking on the link in your online program and invitation, or simply by scanning the QR code on the program that you do have. To bookend the launch of the report, we'll close with a very short press conference during which the media will have an opportunity to ask additional questions. Just a few housekeeping issues here. If you'd be kind enough to turn off your phones, put them on mute, that would be very much appreciated. And during the Q&A session, our preference will be, both for delegates, participants, as well as the media, to introduce yourself first and your profession, position, before proceeding with your question. Well, it gives me great pleasure at this time to invite to the podium a globally renowned economist who for decades has played a strategic role in shaping the African narrative and pushing the transformative development changes that we see in many parts of Africa. Please join me in welcoming Africa's optimist-in-chief, the President of the African Development Bank Group, Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as he comes to the podium to deliver his opening address. Please give him a warm round of applause.
Thank you very much, Victor, and good morning to everybody. Since we are all in the mood of Happy New Year's, let me say Bonne heureuse année à tout le monde. Happy New Year to everybody. Je voudrais
I would like, from the outset, to thank Her Excellency Minister of planning and development of Côte d'Ivoire, also well known as governor to our bank, Mrs. Nala Kabane. Thank you for being here this morning. You're elegant as always, and I would like I would like also to extend my very best wishes for the new year to Mr. Minister, and so I'd like to ask you to convey these best wishes to him. Thank you for being here. Thank you for the Côte d'Ivoire's support to the bank.
And welcome, Your Excellencies, the ambassadors that are here. Thank you all for being here. Happy New Year to you. And thank you for your great support to the African Development Bank. I know your schedules are so busy, but you found the time to be here for this very important meeting. So thank you and welcome, Your Excellencies. Please give it up to them and welcome them to the bank. Of course, I would like to give a special welcome to my executive directors, board members of the bank. Thank you for being here. I hope you had a good vacation. I haven't seen many of you, but I look forward to seeing you. Thank you very much for what you do and for your support, and thank you for being here. I would like to particularly also welcome the senior management staff of the bank. Thank you. You do the work of the bank. You run it every single day, and you do it with so much passion and commitment. And so I would like to thank you for being here, and I wish you a very, very happy New Year. And of course, let me use that opportunity to thank the guys who did the hard work of what I'm going to talk about today. Professor Urama, Kevin Urama, the acting chief economist of the bank and the vice president, and his fantastic team. I think they have a fantastic team, and please really thank them for all the great work. Thank you that you've done. I would like to thank all those that are joining us from around the world. As Dr. Ladokun was saying, I know you have folks from the US, those from Asia, Latin America, from around the world. Thank you for connecting to this particular session and for also thinking about how things are in Africa and what we have to say about the outlook for Africa. Let me also say I am delighted that Professor Jeffrey Sachs is a very long-time friend of mine, distinguished global economist, is going to be joining us on this panel. And also later today, I'm delighted. So thank you all for being here. Your Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, I am pleased to welcome you all to the official launch of this maiden edition of the African Development Bank's report on Africa's macroeconomic performance and outlook. I'd like to start by commending the bank's economic governance and knowledge management complex, led by Professor Kevin Urama, for the continued efforts to provide sound and evidence-based economic intelligence to inform the much-needed structural transformation across African countries as the world, our world, grapples with different types of challenges around the world with multiple and overlapping economic headwinds. As we are all aware, the global macroeconomic conditions have recently become increasingly uncertain with the persistence of multiple shocks that make policymaking and investment decisions, just to put it lightly, very challenging. The highly volatile external environment has spilled over to the African continent, threatening to, in fact, reverse, if not halt, the recovery that we have made from the lingering effects of the COVID-19 pandemic. The dynamic and the persistent nature of these global shocks and their interaction with prevailing pockets of domestic and regional risks require regular diagnosis and targeted policy actions to address their impact on African economies. It's against this backdrop that the African Development Bank has put forward the Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook report that we are talking about today. This is the bank's new biannual publication to be released in the first and the third quarters of each year. And it aims to provide African policymakers, global investors, researchers, and other development partners with up-to-date, evidence-based assessment of the continent's recent macroeconomic performance and short to medium-term outlook amid global economic developments. This new report will be updated with forecasts and analysis from the constant surveillance of regional and global macroeconomic developments. And it will complement. As you know, we have the African Economic Outlook that we release every single year. So this report actually is a complementary report to that. And that bank's annual flagship publication, the African Economic Outlook, will be launched at the sidelines of the bank's annual meetings in May. Of course, this year will be in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt. And the ambassador for Egypt is here. We are looking forward to being there once again in the beautiful city of Sharm el-Sheikh. That will be in May this year. This year's edition of the African Economic Outlook will focus on policies to mobilize private sector financing and harnessing the natural capital for climate change and green development in Africa. The release of this first edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report comes at a time when African economies face significant headwinds as global and domestic shocks undermine progress towards restoring macroeconomic and social stability and sustaining economic recovery due to very high living costs stoked by rising inflationary pressures. Every time you pick up the newspaper, all you see is inflationary trends everywhere in the world. Our estimates show that Africa's average real gross domestic product slowed to 3.8% in 2022. That slowdown reflects the impact of downside factors, including spillover of rising geopolitical tensions, climate change risks, and the lingering impacts of COVID-19 pandemic, which have been amplified by the tightening of global financial conditions and the associated increase in domestic debt service costs. However, despite the slowdown, Africa demonstrated continued resilience, with all but one country maintaining positive growth rates in 2022 and with stable outlooks for 2023 and 2024. Africa's growth rate is projected to average about 4% in 2023 and 2024, and I must say, growth everywhere is actually quite low. And so that's actually much higher than the world's projected averages of 2.7% and 3.2%, respectively. Tighter global financial conditions put pressure on Africa's domestic currencies. And you've seen that in all the countries where you are. Massive amount of devaluation, depreciation of currencies that is stoking inflation in domestic markets. And this is raising the risk of already very high inflation. But inflation is projected to ease in 2023 as countries sustain restrictive monetary and structural policies. Inflation is also expected to decline to single digit by 2024, even lower than the level preceding the outbreak of COVID-19. Now, let me talk about the situation in fiscal positions of countries and current account situations. Both the current account and fiscal positions improved in 2022. The average current account deficit narrowed in 2022 because of improved trade balances buoyed by higher commodity prices. Higher commodity prices and higher exports, while average fiscal deficit narrowed on account of improved revenues, especially among oil exporting countries. And this part of it is one, as president of the bank, that makes me particularly happy and hopeful, as I'm always hopeful, that 5 African countries have projected annual GDP growth rates of more than 5.5%. And that's could return to the league of the world's top 10 fastest growing economies in 2022. So which means that the recovery is good, and although you see have it asymmetric, but you have a number of countries that can return back to the league of the world's fastest growing countries in the world. The projected stability in medium-term growth largely reflects the benefits of policy support in Africa, the global efforts to mitigate the impacts of exogenous shocks and rising uncertainty, and the stable growth in Asia. As you know, Asia, China, many Asian countries, they are the major trading partners for Africa, and that recovery will boost export, trade, and investment for Africa as well. Your Excellencies, African economies clearly are indeed resilient. With 54 countries at different stages of growth, different economic structures, and diverse resource endowments, the pass-through effects of global shocks always will differ by region and, of course, by country. Slowing global demand, tighter financial conditions, and disrupted global value chains therefore have differentiated impacts all across African economies. But despite the confluence of these multiple shocks, growth across all, and I emphasize all, 5 African countries was positive in 2022. And the outlook for 2023-2024 is projected to be stable. With the resumption of global economic activities, and as an alternative source for Europe's energy needs, we all know the challenges that faces. And here, North Africa plays a very important role. Europe is looking for new sources of energy. And so whether it's from Algeria, whether it is from even Libya, we talk about that in the debate, North African countries do provide potential alternative sources to also help Europe. And that, we estimated in this report, could help the region lift its growth to about 4.3% stabilized. In Central Africa, policies to support increased consumer demand and to boost investments will see growth increase to 4.7%. Economic diversification and expansion in infrastructure spending ensure that growth in East Africa averages 4.2%. And in West Africa, the recovery in agriculture and tourism sectors, coupled with expansion in construction and renewable energy projects, ensure that the region grew by 3.6%. Let me say here that as you come to the bank and you walk through the city, all you see in Cote d'Ivoire is massive amount of construction. And that's really very, very important in boosting domestic investment in the economy. And Madam Minister, I want to commend you for that. And we also think that in the case of the rest of West Africa, the 2 big countries, I mean, if you look at Nigeria, it's a big country. And Nigeria's economies have been affected by the decline in oil prices before, and also by insecurity. But as those things stabilize, you will see that Nigeria will lift the regional weighted growth rates within the region as well. So we're looking forward to that happening and being stabilized. Now, in Southern Africa region, managed to grow by 2.5% on the back of strong rebound in tourism activities and resumption of investment spending in mining sectors. Now, this welcome recovery and the economic resilience of African economies, let me say, I am optimist in chief, yes, but let me say it comes with cautious optimism. As in all regions, the medium-term outlook for the continent will continue to evolve in line with the developments in the confluence of overlapping shocks currently buffeting global economies. These include the ripple effects of Russia's invasion of Ukraine, which continues to disrupt Africa's and global supply chains and fueling rising food and energy price inflation. The tightening of global financial conditions and the associated increase in domestic debt service costs. The lingering effects of COVID-19 pandemic, which have reversed Africa's gains in poverty eradication efforts by more than a decade below pre-pandemic levels, and the elevated climate risks, which continue to exacerbate fiscal risks for countries. Your Excellencies, global financial conditions are projected to remain restrictive in the near term, combined with increased volatility in global financial markets and persistent disruptions in global supply chains. This could put further pressure on exchange rates and keep debt vulnerabilities and domestic inflation at elevated levels, threatening food and energy security in most African countries. So we have to keep our eyes focused on those external shocks. These shocks, whether it is energy prices, whether it is inflation, whether it is fragility, or whether it is reduction in investment or even in domestic consumption, all these things have a negative effect on people. So it's not just the statistics, it's what really happens to people. In 2022, because of the global increase in the energy prices and food prices, 15 million more people were driven into extreme poverty, which already was high in Africa in many of the countries. And if we do not have an abatement in these food and energy costs, it could actually plunge Africa into a wrong trajectory in terms of eliminating extreme poverty. And this is where, maybe I should make a comment, is the fact that we actually living here today, I'm going to Senegal. That's because we are organizing a Feed Africa Summit. As you know, if you take the price of food, your consumer price index, probably about 65, 70% of that is the price of food. You can tighten monetary policy, that's fine to drive down inflation. But if you want to deal with market level increase in food prices, what you gotta do is produce more food. And that's why African Development Bank is doing the Feed Africa Summit, which will be actually in a week's time, to see how structurally we can support Africa to produce a lot more food in a more efficient way, in a much more sustainable manner, to be able to drive down in a medium term and long term the price of food. Let me say that overall, the global economy will continue to face enormous challenges in the near term. And this will continue to come from elevated energy and food prices, which will entrench already strong inflationary pressures, heighten debt vulnerabilities and post-tertiary default risks, growth deceleration, and volatilities in global financial markets. And this calls for much needed reforms in the global financial architecture to make it better aligned with the current global market conditions. And the voice to do that is getting louder by the day. And personally, I think they are good calls. I think there needs to be a real significant change in the global financial architecture to meet many of these headwinds we face: structural poverty, debt, shrinking fiscal space for countries, and very high vulnerability all across countries as inflation rises, and also as the tightening of monetary policy in advanced countries drive up interest rates and borrowing costs for many of the countries. So this edition of Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook recognizes the difficult challenges African economies face in navigating this maze of multiple and overlapping risks. Let me list some of those for clarity. First, The high interest rate environment could exacerbate the cost of debt service and see some countries slip into high risk of debt distress. Second, the increasing losses and damages due to more frequent extreme weather events will continue to exacerbate fiscal risks for countries. So climate change will continue to be a big issue. Third, the countries that continue to depend on commodity exports with minimum value addition will continue to be exposed to commodity price volatility risks, and they may miss, in fact, significant opportunities in the global green transition markets. Fourth, continued global and regional conflicts in key spots could exacerbate softer demand and supply chain disruptions. And of course, you know we have elections that are coming up in many African countries. How those elections are done with peace, with security, with transparency, with accountability are going to be very, very critical for investor confidence in Africa. And so there are those political risks that we have to really watch and make sure that they do not disturb the macroeconomic environment of our nations. The report, therefore, advocates for bold policy actions at national, regional, and global scales to help African economies to mitigate the compounding risks. Policy recommendations that you will find in this report include strategic mix of monetary, fiscal, and structural policies to curb inflation while protecting the most vulnerable populations and economic sectors to continue to spur growth. Second, strategic industrial policies that are needed to correct market failures, to drive export orientation, and to encourage healthy competition in key sectors. Also, you will find in this report policies to boost regional trade. Of course, we have the African Continental Free Trade Area and how we reduce Africa's vulnerability to global shocks by making sure that we trade among ourselves and therefore reduce our global exposures to volatilities in the global supply chains. So that these policies to boost regional trade to enhance resilience are also well articulated in this report, as well as policies to mobilize domestic resources as well as private sector investment in Africa. Your Excellencies, the report that you will get also reiterates the call for accelerated implementation of structural reforms that will drive private sector industrialization in key sectors, in agriculture and agribusiness, in climate smart and just energy transition, in value chain development in natural resource sectors, especially minerals, and as we talk about green development, and of course, in quality healthcare infrastructure and the pharmaceutical industries, and in digitalization and e-governance, among more. In our forthcoming African Economic Outlook Report 2023, to be launched at our annual meetings, as I said, in Sharm el-Sheikh, Egypt, in May 2023, we will dip in further. We will examine options for mobilizing the private sector's accumulated savings, both at home and abroad, and challenging them to urgently finance the continent's infrastructure and social development. That report will articulate policies and options to leverage Africa's abundant, very abundant natural capital for green growth and sustainable development. Your Excellencies, we need all to join our hands together to harness the enormous development opportunities across the resilient economies of Africa. The continent has shown over time that its diversity is a source of resilience. Harnessing these opportunities will be key as the continent continues to build back better and bolder to secure a resilient, prosperous, and sustainable future for all Africans. I am therefore very pleased and delighted to release Africa's Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook 2023 report. Let us stand together to build the Africa we want. A continent that continues to be pivotal in improving the quality of lives of its citizens and contributing to sustainable stability of economies everywhere. People say, I am optimistic about the continent. I am aware of the global headwinds. I am aware of inflation. I am aware of geopolitical risks. I am aware as well as how those things affect the capital flows out of Africa. I am aware of the food insecurity challenges we face. I am aware of the debt challenges that we face. I am aware of the structural issues we still have to do to make our economies not dependent on commodities alone, but higher value added. I am aware of the infrastructure deficit gaps that we still have. But yet I am not discouraged by these challenges because I believe that Africa is a resilient continent. And the numbers that you have seen in this report will show you that in fact Africa is recovering well, and on a good trajectory to be able to accelerate further once the global economic conditions improve. So, Excellencies, ladies and gentlemen, we will now listen to a presentation of the key findings of this report. Let me, I thought I brought a copy of that report. Where is it? Yeah. Yeah, this is the report. Because when I keep saying report, you wonder where is the report? Well, this is the report. And just to let you know, I was talking to the chief economist. I have been traveling. I got this report yesterday at about, I think, 10 p.m. or so. I've read every single line in this report. There's not a single line in this report that I have not read as president of the bank. If you don't want me to know anything, don't write it down. And so as I came in this morning, I was showing this to the acting senior chief economist. He said, how in the world were you able to do that? I said, that's because I stayed up until about 3:30 a.m. reading your report. And I am excited with this report. And I therefore would like to thank Professor Kevin Urama and his team for a brilliant job that they have done. As I was reading this report, I was excited by the thoroughness of the report. I was excited by the forthrightness of the report. I was excited that this report was not putting on rose glasses to say everything is going to be hunky-dory fine, but actually looks at what we need to do policy-wise, governance-wise, political-wise, investment-wise, but also in terms of macroeconomic and fiscal policy stabilization of our countries. So therefore, please kindly put your hands together and thank the acting chief economist and his brilliant team for a report I, as president of the bank, can say I am very proud of. And therefore, let me now welcome Professor Kevin Urama to come here and then explain, after you've gotten all that clap, you have to now tell them the contents of the report. Well done, and keep it up.
Thank you, Mr. President. Can you put up the report, please? Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank Group, Your Excellency, Mrs. Niale Kaba, Minister of Planning and Development for Côte d'Ivoire, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, members of the Diplomatic Corps, Executive Directors of the African Development Bank Group, senior management colleagues of the African Development Bank Group, distinguished guests, and a lot of distinguished academics, private sector actors, and heads of institutions connected globally. I'd like to join President Adesina to thank you so much for joining us today. Happy New Year. I think it's really a new year for Africa, a year that brings future tidings, positive tidings after the continent has been buffeted by several confounding shocks that the president has already enumerated in his excellent keynote speech. So this report, as the president has shared with us, seeks to provide you, decision makers, private sector actors, global public investors, with evidence-based facts on where Africa is headed to inform your decisions and investment flows. And I hope that you will share the optimism that has been shared by the optimist-in-chief of the African continent, the president of the African Development Bank Group. Having participated with the team to draft this report, I was really very optimistic to see the resilience quality of the continent, which the president has already shared, and then the clear positive direction we have in all the macroeconomic fundamentals that investors and decision makers should care about. So this report will provide a bird's eye view on the growth, performance, and outlook of the continent, a lot of which has already been shared by the president, the key macroeconomic fundamentals and how it's shaping up in the short to medium term, and look at the socioeconomic effects of all these challenges that the president has already shared with us. Let me just summarize those challenges so we'll keep them in mind as we go ahead. It's something the president called the 3 Cs. The continued impacts of COVID-19 and the potentials of other health pandemics that could arise, the continued impacts of climate change, which is creating a lot of losses and damages, that is putting a lot more pressure on the fiscal balances of countries, and also the continued impacts of geopolitical risks and tensions and pockets of conflicts around the continent. These 3 challenges has created a lot of the risks that the president has already talked about. And then we'll talk about policy recommendations, where I will delve a little bit more in detail. The president has given us the headlines of that, and I hope that in this presentation, I will dwell a bit more in the details and draw some conclusions. So here, we see the story that the president has already told us. If you look there in that map on the left side, the graph on the left side, you see that red line representing Africa. You can see that in the pack of countries and of regions and continents, the continent is doing really very well. After the depression, or the contraction in real GDP growth in 2020 that we saw, up to 1.6%, the continent rebounded in 2021, and despite all these global shocks that has been explained by the president, the continent has managed to continue to grow at a rate which is not only positive, but looking bright going forward, at a rate which is higher than most of its peers, coming second to Asia, but higher than many other regions that are represented in that graph. And again, at a rate where, when we looked at the macroeconomic fundamentals that underpins the growth story, we see positive trajectories across all of them. The significant volatilities in the global financial markets, the inflationary pressures that the president has talked about, the increased cost of capital and debt servicing costs, the disruption in the global supply chains, and the softened demand in the global major export markets where Africa depends on, has been part of what created the challenges. But you can see that due to good policies, macroeconomic reforms happening on the continent, and good governance that we are seeing on the continent, we are seeing that positive rebound. So I would actually want to give a clap to our leaders on the continent, because you are doing really well, despite the challenges that the whole global economy is facing. To put that in context, we know now that many regions of the world are facing serious risks of recession. But as the president has shown us and explained to us, all the regions of this continent have not only retained a positive growth, but the risk of recession is near to none on the continent, except in one country where the growth is not going the right direction, for several reasons which you will also find in that report. The President has already given us the numbers with regard to the rebounded growth in East Africa, in Central Africa, in West Africa, and all the regions of the continent, so I'm not going to go back into that. But let me dwell a little bit more on the differences that we've seen with regard to the structures of economies on the continent. Tourism-dependent economies on the continent have grown by about 6.3% in 2022, sustaining its recovery from 4.2% in 2021. Just mark the numbers, it's going up. This has been due to relative easing of pandemic risks, household savings in the tourism source countries that was accumulated during the pandemic, and the expected continued growth in tourism as COVID restrictions ease around the world. The average growth in oil exporting countries declined marginally to 4% in 2022 from 4.2% in 2021 due to sharp growth deceleration in Libya and tepid growth in Nigeria. This is also something that we need to keep in mind, because you see that countries that are really dependent on exporting of raw minerals and materials are the ones that are actually very much exposed to global shocks when it does happen. Other resource-intensive economies are estimated to have declined to 2.8% in 2022 from 4.7% in 2021. Now, that's a big decline, explaining the reason why the African Development Bank's AEO, African Economic Outlook Report for 2023, will be focusing a lot more on how to change that story in the natural resource sector for Africa's resource-dependent economies. So this challenge for resource-dependent economies was heightened by inflation on the household consumption and subdued global demand for some of Africa's major export commodities. As the President has already shared with us, tighter macroeconomic and financial conditions around the world put pressure on several domestic currencies on the continent. But again, the story in Africa were relatively positive, even with the continued buffeting of those challenges around the world. While most currencies depreciated, especially in commodity exporting countries again, that lost substantial value from a depreciation of 21% in Malawi, 21% in Malawi to 24% in Sierra Leone and 33% in Ghana, but we also had the highest depreciation, 69% in South Sudan. But we have positive story as well, even in that regard, because we had appreciations of currencies in Angola by 29%, Seychelles by 16%, and in Zambia by 14%. When you read the report, we tried to dig into what are the things that allowed countries that had appreciation in their economies to experience that positive gain, even when the global economy were all facing significant challenges due to the tighter global market conditions that we saw. Some of these depreciations, like I've mentioned, were driven by the tighter global market conditions, weak external demands, macroeconomic imbalances, and constrained revenues, and also weak investment flows in some of these countries. Then accommodative policies that has continued after COVID in some of the countries, and more favorable market conditions allowed the appreciation of currencies to happen. When you look at consumer price inflation on the continent, as the President already shared with us, we're seeing a positive direction as well. While inflation rose by 0.9 percentage points in 2022, reaching 13.8% in that year from 12.9% in 2021, we're seeing that it's going to go down, even though last year was the highest record in terms of the inflationary pressures that the continent faced. By regions, we saw in East Africa a 25.1% in inflation, West Africa 16.8%, Southern Africa at 13.2%. So these are regions where the inflationary pressures, the average inflationary pressures went into double digits. We'd like to see that go down. But we have good stories as well, where we have moderate and single-digit inflations, especially in northern part of Africa. In North Africa, we had only 8.1%, and in Central Africa, 7.3%. If you read the report, you will see that Central Africa has really done so well due to several policies and favorable market conditions they faced during the year 2022, a lot of which was explained in the report as well. The relatively low inflation in Central Africa was reflecting what I have said, coordinated monetary policies that I have implemented. So I would say kudos to that region as well. But also they enjoy the benefits of regional, relatively stable currencies that they had. Inflationary pressures generally on the continent was mostly imported inflation, driven by the pass-through effects arising from Russia's invasion of Ukraine on food and energy prices, and also sustained global supply chain disruptions following COVID and the global tensions that we've seen. And I have to say, beyond the global tensions, the growing calls for regionalization of trade, for friendshoring, for reshoring in trade is creating some movements within the global trade architecture that we are watching. In East Africa, the inflation there mirrored large price increases in Sudan and Ethiopia due to both supply constraints and demand pressures in both countries. But the increase in Southern Africa was largely due to inflationary pressures in most of the countries of the region, especially in Zimbabwe, which recorded the largest increase of 285% in 2022, very significantly up from the 98% of the previous year, and also driven by markup pricing of imports in that country. So when you look at all this story, you'll find that inflation, the most positive part for me in the report regarding the inflationary pressures, is that on average, inflation is projected to gradually ease, declining from this 13.5% in 2023 to 8.8% on average in 2024. And this is below the 9.2% we had on average in 2019 before the COVID pandemic. So the continent is going back with regard to macroeconomic fundamentals to pre-COVID era. And this was also lower, the projected 8.8% is lower than the 9.6% average we saw between the years 2014 and 2018 at the end of the commodity super cycle. So these are all very positive with regard to inflation. On fiscal and current account balances for the continent, I will not dwell on it a lot because the president has also explained that. But what we see is that the direction is also on the positive side, where fiscal deficit has narrowed to an average of 4.4% in 2022 from 5.2% in 2021. And this is because of improved revenue performance in many countries, improved tax prudence and tax revenue collection in many countries, especially also the fallouts, additional revenues that came to some of the oil exporting countries because of the energy challenges every region had. Most of the not oil exporting countries like Angola, Chad, Congo, Equatorial Guinea, Gabon, and Libya recorded surpluses, with an average deficit only falling to 3.6% of GDP in 2022, from 4.8% in the previous year. So when you look at that same story as, again, with regard to fiscal deficit and current account balances, Africa is headed in the right direction. Can we do more? Yes. Do we need more? Yes. But it's just like saying that what we've done, what the countries have done in 2022 is very positive and should be continued. I've also mentioned on the current account balances, when you look at the same story, we find that same continued decline in the current account deficits across the continent. But one of the most positive here is to see that capital inflows on the continent has rebounded in 2021 from the fallout caused by COVID-19. But still, on average, we're expecting that the continent will still have a net outflow, portfolio outflow of about 22.5 billion in 2022 when all the statistics are reconciled. So while financial flows is going the right direction, we still need to do more in terms of stemming capital outflows from this continent. Now, the next challenge, which we have all discussed so much, I've discussed current account, is the debt vulnerability, which remains elevated, even though getting better in some countries, but we're seeing greater risks, not because countries are borrowing more, because of the tighter global financial conditions and the appreciation of the US dollar. So we expect that the debt to GDP ratio will remain elevated at 67% in 2022, and this is expected to go down to 65% in 2023 and 2024, pending continued prudent policy implementation and public financial management in countries. By the end of September 2022, 23 African countries were either in debt distress or at high risk of debt distress, from 20 in 2020, which means the number of countries that are getting into that risk is increasing. When we try to decompose the debt-creating flows, this shows us that Africa's debt dynamics is mainly driven by exchange rate depreciation and high primary deficits. So if you look at the report, you will see we try to understand exactly what is happening on the continent and why has this debt challenge remained a sustained problem on the continent. Now, all these macroeconomic fundamentals means more for us as a development bank, and I guess for all of us, with regard to the impacts on people. So what are the socioeconomic impacts of these dynamics that we're seeing? On this graph, you will see that poorer households have borne most of the burden from the current wave of high food and energy price inflation due to the confounding challenges that we have explained. So we see that many in Africa, on average, households spend about 40.7% of their incomes on food and energy. 36.3% of that is on food. And this is on food expenditure. But despite the large number of Africans that are involved in agriculture, households only receive, on average, 15.2% of incomes from food sales. So on the net, there's a lot of outflows from households in terms of just buying food to eat. And that underscores, again, the need for the push that the president is having with regard to boosting agricultural production through technologies for African agriculture's transformation in Africa. And the summit he's announced that we're going to have in Dakar next week. So this challenge of having more proportion of their income spent on food, when you look at the graph, you see that the higher proportion of that income is in the low-income households. And this is what has created the 15 billion people, additional people, that were pushed into extreme poverty. And I have to say, one of the worrying sides is malnutrition as well. So not only that many countries estimated 15 million people in 2022, additional to the 26.9 that we had in the AEO for 2021, were pushed into extreme poverty in 2022. When you see the effects of food, energy, and the combined effects of that, you will see where the pressures are coming from. And this already leads us to where countries need to focus with regard to policies: energy, agriculture. If we solve those two, we will be able to alleviate a lot of the challenges for the most vulnerable people on the continent. So when we go forward, considering all this, when you read the report, please, you will find details on how those transmission effects happened, both for food and energy, and for your countries, then what policies that could help to address that. The President has highlighted all the risks, so I'm not going to go back into it, but the global recession and softer demand will remain a high risk in 2023, just like high interest rates and cost of debt servicing. Many African countries have higher cost of debt servicing even if they have not borrowed more because of the appreciation of the US dollar. So, and also this creates challenges not only for Africa, but also for the creditors, because no creditor wants a default. But what this confluence of factors is creating is a higher risk of debt default in some African countries. Another one which is always topical is the physical risks of climate change, which is increasing the fiscal risks of countries. Because countries spend a lot of time building infrastructure, and then in just one high impact climate event, it gets washed away. And those infrastructure will have to be rebuilt. And that's in addition to the additional cost of adaptation and mitigation and the policy changes that is also shifting resources away from the continent. So the confluence of factors on climate change and climate change impacts deserve continued attention. But another one which has always worried me since I started doing economics is understanding why Africa, with the abundance of natural resources it has, continues to depend on primary resource sales. And our analysis show that commodity dependence exposes Africa to two things. One, you get less the more you sell your commodities, because the real price of Africa's commodities in the global market is going down since 1960. And then it also exposes to high volatility of growth. If you look at GDP growth on the continent, it tries to mirror the prices of commodities. So it's like we're just rising and falling depending on the temperature in the global markets. So we need to address those risks. These are high risks for us. Low risks, the President has also mentioned, we still have very low rates of COVID vaccination, and as the world opens up, there's every risk. Potential is still low to moderate, but there's a potential risk of a resurgence of COVID or any other variant or any other health pandemic. Regional conflicts we watch on the continent. We need to look at different countries. There are some of the regional conflicts, and the type of conflicts are also changing. That's actually impacting market activities and the business world. Then the political risks in terms of policy reversals that could occur if we have challenges, and also the consumer confidence, impacts on consumer confidence, are things that we need to watch. Let me spend a few time to talk a little bit on the policy recommendations that we come up with in this report. The President raised the issue about policy coordination. We have the traditional tools we use, the fiscal policy, the monetary policy, the structural policies, and oftentimes when they're implemented independent of each other, they create knock-on effects on business environment and the general money flow in the markets. So there's very significant need for a timely and aggressive monetary policy tightening for countries that have acute inflation. So we need to consider what is going on in particular countries. So we cannot generalize for everyone. But coordinating that fiscal and monetary policy to optimize outcomes of targeted policy interventions to tame inflation while also addressing fiscal pressures in the countries is critical. So this is something that we will be working with countries on country-by-country basis in our country-focused reports, which we'll be releasing in June to try and address with regard to specific countries on this continent and specific regions as well. Boosting trade, as the President has mentioned, especially focusing on manufactured products and cushioning economies from the volatile commodity market that we've talked about. How do we help countries to boost trade on the things that the continent has? Accelerating structural reforms that the President has talked about in tax administration is very, very important. And that is why the African Development Bank has launched the Public Financial Management Academy to help countries with that. But investing in digitization and e-governance to create better transparency and enact rules that will curb the flow, the outward flow of capital from the continent, illicit financial flows, will also remain very important. But we can't underscore institutional governance to leverage private sector financing. The financing needs, as we estimated in the AEO, is huge, and the public sector cannot do it alone. So policies on country-by-country basis to be able to mobilize private sector is a critical one that remains in addressing the issues on the continent. Structural budget deficits and accumulation of budget debt, it has specific policies as well for specific countries. So I can't go into so much details. We are currently working with several countries on the continent under the Public Financial Management Academy and the Debt Action Plan to try and address some of those issues. But while we do this, we remember that the more vulnerable, the poorer households suffer the impacts more. And therefore, there remain need for support to the more vulnerable households in terms of cash transfers and other supportive policies in that regard. On boosting trade and enhancing resilience, to enhance resilience to spillovers on the continent, we already have the instruments, the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement. But we need to invest more on regional hard and soft infrastructure to ease the cost of trade between countries. Promote free movement of goods and services on this continent. It might sound simple, but it actually adds a lot to the cost of doing business between countries on this continent. But we also need to strengthen the Africa payment system to ease financial and transactions being done within the continent. And as well, leverage a lot more of the Africa Continental Free Trade Agreement that the continent has already enacted. And for us, the private sector remains central, and mobilizing private sector demands a focused attention. And that is why our AEO 2023 will be focusing on just that. But the multilateral development banks should think very carefully about how to use their risk capital to catalyze private sector financing for inclusive growth and sustainable development on the continent, while countries also look at policies that will enable government-enabled private sector development, I would call it. But the global financial architecture itself will need to be looked at, because the current structure of that global financial architecture continues to limit financial flows to areas of need to achieve the global sustainable development we have all committed to. So what are the key takeaways for us? Global recession and economic resilience is the story of Africa. Amid heightened risk of global recession, African economies continues to show resilience. I think that deserves a clap. So despite the confluence of the multiple shocks, growth across all 53 African countries was positive and with a stable outlook. And as the President has already told us, 5 best performing countries will return to the league of 10 fastest growing economies in the world. But this welcome recovery and welcome story comes with a cautious optimism, as the President has talked about, because of the risks that remain that the President has talked about. So countries, regions, and the continent need bold policy actions. And because of the diversity of the continent, those policy actions need to be tailored to specific needs of countries. And we'll be there to work with you going forward to meet that. But across the continent, one thing is common: leveraging the private sector, leveraging the private sector, and leveraging the private sector. That's the way to go. And we will be talking with you a lot more about this when we come to the AEO that will be launched in May. Ladies and gentlemen, my key takeaway from this is that if I were an investor, I should jump on a plane and head for Africa. And seriously that. Because when we've looked at all economies, of all economies across the continent, Africa is really standing, across the world, Africa is really standing out, not only because of these positive macroeconomic fundamentals that you have seen, but also because of the huge potentials that Africa has always had. With a market size of 1.46 billion people, 60% of them 25 years of age, is a huge market to harness. Rich endowments in both renewable and non-renewable energy resources to power climate-smart and green economy transitions is a continent where the whole world should really try to focus on if we really are serious about climate change, addressing climate change and achieving the Sustainable Development Goals. The continent also has significant potentials in blue economy revolution, with 75%, and I mean 75%, of its countries having huge potentials in the blue economy, markets. Again, those interested in investing in blue economy, Africa is the place to go to. And the continent has more than 20% of global annual production of 5 key minerals. If you look at those minerals, you wonder why we say Africa is poor. Africa holds 80% of platinum, 77% of cobalt, 51% of manganese, 46% of diamonds, 39% of chromium, 22% of gold deposits, and over 60 to 65% of arable land still remaining to feed the world. So smart investors come to Africa. Policymakers in Africa enact policies to make sure that these potentials benefit the people of Africa. And the strategic industrial policies we've talked about, very simple ones we would like to focus on: local content policies and franchising policies. Try and attract those big conglomerates to come and invest on the continent, create jobs, drive sustainable development transitions, and improve the quality of lives of our people. Thank you, Mr. President.
Thank you, Professor Kevin Urama, for really what is an expansive tour de force, but a synthesized overview of a robust macroeconomic performance and outlook report. Thank you for highlighting and breaking things down significantly for non-economists, myself included. And thank you also for highlighting a few insightful conclusions, including the fact that in spite of heightened risks of global recession, Africa shows resilience. Africa's economic resilience, however, is undergirded with cautious optimism, as yourself and Dr. Adeshina has pointed out, and bold policy actions are needed to address the effects of inflation and subdued growth in order to attract investment capital and bridge financing gaps. To that, Dr. Adeshina earlier pointed out that the threats to economic resilience require accurate diagnostics, which the Macroeconomic Performance Outlook report seeks to provide relevant data for. But I think it's also significant to note again, as Dr. Adeshina said, that it's not the data that's important, so that we don't run with things and say, oh, well, it's a fait accompli, it's done. But it's really what we do with the data moving forward. So, ladies and gentlemen, kindly give Dr. Additioner and Professor Kevin Urama a joint round of applause. It is now my honor to invite to the podium for the official unveiling of the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report, President Akinwumi Additioner, Her Excellency Mrs. Niale Kaba, the Ivory Coast Minister of Planning and Development, and the Chief Economist and Vice President of the African Development Bank, Professor Kevin Urama. Professor Urama, I'm assuming that you will provide direction in this regard. So the podium is yours. Dr. Additioner, Madam Kaba. Okay, I think we're going to need a cue here, and the cue is going to be very, very simple. We will let Dr. Additioner and Madam Kaba, as well as Professor Rama, jointly do the unveiling, but we're going to do it this way. I'm going to say 1, 2, 3, and on 5, I want you to say high five. That would be the cue. So, ladies and gentlemen, 1, 2, 3, 4, and 5. And there we go. The 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report, produced by a hardworking team here at the African Development Bank. Congratulations. Ladies and gentlemen, kindly give the team and the bank a round of applause. Thank you, Dr. Additioner and Madam Niale Kaba. I'm going to have to ask you to remain on the podium for the next segment of the launch. So kindly take a seat. Well, for the next segment, which will be our panel discussion, I'm going to, thank you, Madam. And Dr. Additioner, right in the middle. We really are delighted to have with us today during our panel discussion 3 distinguished, globally acknowledged development leaders. Joining us in the studio here in Abidjan, Dr. Akinwumi Additioner, President of the African Development Bank Group, and Madam Niale Kaba, Ivory Coast Minister of Planning and Development, otherwise fondly described by Dr. Additioner as Madame La Force Tranquille, given her reputation for getting things done, and not just getting things done, getting them done absolutely very well. And joining us from Washington, actually from New York, is a distinguished economist and a passionate development advocate. The New York Times once described him as probably the most important economist in the world. It's a pleasure to have Professor Jeffrey Sachs, the director of Columbia University's Center for Sustainable Development and the president of the UN Sustainable Development Solutions Network, with us this morning, all the way in New York. Thank you very much for joining us, Professor Sachs. Can you hear us? I'm assuming you're out there and live and direct. Can we have Professor Sachs on screen? Okay, while we're trying to sort out, oh, there he is. The one, the only Professor Jeffrey Sachs. Welcome, welcome, welcome. Well, I'm going to start with you, Professor Sachs, considering that you're joining us bright and early in New York this morning. I'm assuming you've had your coffee this morning. Well, you know, there we go. The report points to the changing global economic environment with implications for key economic performance indicators across Africa. This includes debt vulnerability and the risks of default. So, what are your views on these findings, and what should Africa do to address these specific challenges? Okay, could you just hold on a second? Professor Six, can we have audio up, please? All right.
Thank you very, very much. Let me start by saying that this is a wonderful report, and I want to congratulate the African Development Bank team and Professor Urama for producing such a wonderful report. And it's also a very important report in that it shows the resiliency and growth of the African economies despite all of the shocks of recent years. If one had been asked in 2019, suppose that there would be a global pandemic, suppose after that that there would be a major war, sanctions regime, and disruption of the world energy markets and food markets, suppose that interest rates were going to rise significantly in the United States and in other key currencies, what would you expect for Africa? I think many people would have said potentially disaster. But in fact, what this report emphasizes is that African economies are growing. They're growing consistently. I agree completely with what Professor Urama said in closing just now, that Africa is the place to invest. I'm actually going to double down on that in the following sense. Africa is growing at 4% per year right now. I do strongly believe, and it's not only on wish and hope, but actually on analytics, that Africa can and I think will rise to growth of 7% or more per year consistently in the coming decades. And that what we're going to see in the next decades, building on the resiliency that we see in this report, a real acceleration of Africa's sustainable development so that Africa will be the fast-growing part of the world economy. In a way, it needs to be. It remains the poorer part of the world economy, but that, on the positive side, means more headroom for rapid growth. China, as we all know, grew at least 7 to 10% per year consistently for 40 years between 1980 and 2020. I strongly believe, again, I would argue, if I had time to elaborate on solid analytical grounds, that between 2023 and 2063, Africa is going to achieve 7 to 10% growth, and that the Africa we have known in the past as being poor and unstable will be a thing of the past, because this is the time of opportunity for a breakthrough that is on its way right now. I think the breakthrough has three components, if I may say so. First is integration of the African economy. Africa is 54 countries, but together as a single integrated economy, it's at the same size as China and India, almost identical, 1.4 billion across the three big parts of the world economy. If the African Union and if the member states continue on this path of rapid integration, and that's integration in policy, it's integration in transboundary infrastructure, it's integration in a single market, this will substantially increase Africa's resilience and rate of growth. Second is what we've heard about strategic industrial policy. I think it is absolutely grounded, by the way, on what will be a massive upgrading of skills in the years ahead, because we're going to see a flowering of higher education and advanced skills across Africa. It's already happening, but it will be massive, and it will underpin this strategic transformation of industry. And the final part is finance. Africa does not have too much debt, by the way. The problem is the debt is very short term, the international capital markets too unstable, not enough investors understand Africa's forward-looking growth prospects. But we're going to have a breakthrough in long-term sustainable development finance. It's going to be led by the African Development Bank, by the way, as it is being led. But I personally believe that the AFDB should be lending many times more than it's lending now, using its good name, its strong policies, its strong balance sheet, and its unique role to increase substantially, especially the investments in human capital and in physical infrastructure, which will underpin a massive increase of business capital investment as well. So just in a nutshell, this report shows that Africa is growing, is resilient, and has the prospects for an acceleration of growth. And the key underpinnings of that acceleration will be integration in Africa, will be strategic policies, not only in industry, but in skill development as well, I would emphasize, and also in finance. So I think this report will be part of a series of reports showing an acceleration of growth in the years ahead. And I want to end by, again, agreeing completely with Professor Urama that investors look forward. This is going to be the place of rapid growth in the world economy, and there's a lot of interesting places for building new long-term business development and business growth, and that is what Africa is going to be known for in the years ahead. Thank you for including me in today's launch.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. We're not going to let you end as yet. I love what you said. You said the Africa we know as poor and unstable will become a thing of the past. Kind of reminds me about your 2005 book, The End of Poverty, where you wrote that Africa's governance is poor because Africa is poor. Almost 18 years later, have things changed, or does more need to be done, particularly in light of the three issues that you mentioned: enhanced integration, massive upskilling, and increased finance? What's your take? Where are we today?
Things have definitely improved, which is why we've seen that despite all of the global shocks thrown at Africa, Africa continues to move forward. Now, I think that the most exciting part for me has been the African integration, that the AU went from an important meeting place of governments to an actual single market in more and more areas. And when we build in infrastructure in the years ahead for tapping Africa's vast zero carbon energy also, because Africa's got the sunshine, it's got the geothermal, it's got the hydropower that still is to be tapped. And we do that at a continental scale. This will be a further breakthrough. So there are lots of good things happening, but there's even more to come. There are improvements. I think with 54 countries, you always have a mix of governance, but I would say if the 54 countries understand, especially the leaders understand, put the faith and put the future into this strong African integration, this is going to be the key to success.
Thank you very much, Professor Sachs. My next question is to Madam Nyali Kaba. From your perspective and experience, first as a former Minister of Economy and Finance, and in your current position as Minister of Planning and Development in Côte d'Ivoire, what is your perspective regarding some of the key challenges facing African economies in 2023, as indicated in the Macroeconomic Performance Outlook report? Your take, Madam.
Merci.
Thank you very much for including me on this panel. I would also like to congratulate the President of the African Development Fund for the initiative launching this report. It's a report that will help our governments in the decision-making process and in policy formulation. I'd also like to commend the quality of the report, which provides a backdrop of the current context. We've had 2021, which was a year of shocks of the aftermath of COVID-19, and 2022 was also even more difficult with the Ukraine crisis and the deepening of geopolitical tensions. As you know, Côte d'Ivoire has and other countries faced with many crises, and this has an impact on our population. So our populations have had, especially the most vulnerable. So for these particular populations and the most vulnerable amongst them, we've had as a country to grapple with the effects of the global crises. But this is also, there's also the impact of displaced populations coming into Côte d'Ivoire due to these multiple shocks, and that the government has had to contend with. So to respond to your question, Côte d'Ivoire has been able to remain resilient, much like other African countries. This was rather unexpected, as the professor indicated. We thought that with the confluence of shocks, there would be, or this would be a disaster, would lead to disaster in Africa. But I think that we were up to the challenge, and in Côte d'Ivoire, our economy has proven to be rather resilient. So emphasis on governance and the measures undertaken were aimed at supporting all sectors, so large corporates, SMEs, and the various sectors in which the most vulnerable operate. There were also direct measures aimed at the populations and the most vulnerable amongst them, particularly those who could no longer work or do their jobs. So this made it possible for us to remain afloat in 2021, and with a 2% growth rate, and in 2022 increased to 7.1% growth rate. 2022 was quite difficult. It's true that the challenges were much starker, but I think that in terms of outlook, and there's a lot of promise. Policies were adjusted in order to contend with the various issues and challenges. So I'm not sure whether in terms of measures I should focus on the various avenues we'll be pursuing. But let me say that in our development plan, we have focused on what we call a solidarity-based Côte d'Ivoire. Some of the first measures, for some of the first areas of intervention or action has been to really refocus our policies on the weakest, on the most vulnerable, be it in terms of direct redistribution or many other measures aimed at ensuring that the most vulnerable are at the core of our attention. In agriculture, which is one of the strongest sectors in our economy, we were faced with two types of challenges. The rent-based or windfall-based agriculture, where we were seeking to achieve greater transformation in order to create more jobs for our youth. Youth is a major challenge for us, so more jobs and more local transformation of our commodities. And with the Russia-Ukraine crisis, there was also more of a focus on food security matters and nutrition matters as well. What can I add to this? Obviously, financing, access to finance, and conditions being what they are, with rising value of the U.S. dollars and tightened market conditions, but also debt. And we need to keep a very close eye on this. And as you know, Cote d'Ivoire has greatly reformed its budget law, and so we have a number of reforms we're undertaking here, as stressed in your reforms, and taxation reforms as well. But of course, there are still issues pertaining to collection. But with digitization, there will be improvements. So I would also add that this is an interesting report. Which comes in a volatile and quite challenging context, and provides us with a source of optimism. You see that Africa can take action, it can harness the current opportunities as well, and this is, I believe, what we're doing in Cote d'Ivoire. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Your Excellency. Quite a lot there. The key takeaways: Cote d'Ivoire is resilient, and you're up to the challenge thanks to good governance and a collaborative, multi-sectoral solutions approach, as well as a solidarity-based approach to improving the lives of the most vulnerable in Cote d'Ivoire, as well as greater transformation in the area of agriculture, as well as digital reforms to accelerate growth moving forward. Prior to COVID-19, Cote d'Ivoire was one of the fastest growing economies in the world, and it's heartening to know once again that Cote d'Ivoire is on track to repeat that in the years ahead. Congratulations, Madam. My next question is to Africa's optimist-in-chief, Dr. Adeshina. In your speech earlier, you called for reforms of the global financial architecture to better align with current economic conditions and the situation that many countries face today. Now, if you don't mind, what I'd like for you to do is use this opportunity to break that down a little bit and explain why this is critically important for African economies.
Thank you very much, Victor, for that. I think the thing to bear in mind is we are clearly, and I'm talking globally, we are clearly off track when it comes to sustainable development goals and the amount of financing that we need to be able to do that. Of course, we are a multilateral financial institution. We're doing all the best that we can. But we've got to realize that we are facing a world today in which we have multiple challenges. We have geopolitical issues that both Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Madam Minister have said. You know, we have an issue with regard to how we feed ourselves. We have a problem in which the world can't feed itself because of the conflict in Ukraine, which has added to major problems. The third issue we have is the supply chain disruptions. We had that during COVID. Now we have that during the situation now with food and agriculture. We have rising debt in many of the countries, and as the chief economist mentioned, you have a situation in which, as tightening monetary policies are being pursued, United States, Fed raises interest rate. You have EU interest rates also raised, and that means that the debt service costs are continuing to balloon. And I hear what my friend Professor Jeffrey Sachs said, about okay, maybe we don't have too much debt, but the fact of the matter is that our debt to GDP ratio, okay, maybe it's okay, it's probably 68%, 70%. but we still have significant amount of debt. And how do we make sure that developing countries are able to have the resources they need, okay, to be able to fast-track their development? So when it comes to the global financial architecture, what do I think really needs to be done? First, I think it's very important for Africa to be better represented in the global financial systems that we have. Okay, you've had reforms being talked about that are very much needed. So I think both in terms of the International Monetary Fund, we have better representation. The second is to also make sure that we are focusing on optimizing the global financial architecture. There are three components to that. First is have the multilateral financial institutions. And second, you have the International Monetary Fund. And third, you got a private sector. So when you take the international monetary, the global financial architecture, we need to work better, a lot more in partnerships as multilateral financial institutions, which we do. We work very closely with the World Bank, with Asian Development Bank, with the European Investment Bank, European Bank for Reconstruction and Development. We need to pool our resources better. So the key word on that is partnership. The second is we need to let the regional development banks, maybe I'll use both sides that I can turn to you sometimes, the regional financial institutions to focus on regional issues, right? And have maybe the World Bank and IMF focus on the global issues. So there has to be a connection between that global and that regional. The third, I think it's very important, is to ensure that something like the special drawing rights, of course the IMF has. There was, about 650 billion of that was actually released, of which Africa got just about $33 billion. But if you take a look at the IMF focusing on global macroeconomic stability, right, and the development banks like ourselves focusing on what we do better than anybody else, which is on sectoral things, on agriculture, on health, on infrastructure, and things like that, that's our raison d'etre. And so how you actually take that and you link it to global macroeconomic and financial stability role of the IMF, that means there's a complementarity in the global financial architecture. We should not be competing for resources. We should be complementing ourselves. And I think the special drawing rights provides a very good way to actually do that. So take, for example, we are working together now with the IMF, and we know that with IMF, if we get the special drawing rights for Africa, which African heads of state have asked for, that Africa should get about $100 billion, if some of that comes to the African Development Bank, we can leverage that 4 times. So I think IMF providing that for countries, but some of that coming to the African Development Bank allows us to have a multiplicative effect. So you have a lot more impact. So a $10 billion to the African Development Bank suddenly becomes $40 billion to Africa to focus on health, on agriculture, infrastructure, youth employment, health, and all of those things. So that complementarity, in my view, it's very, very important. The third area I want to say is take a look at global capital. We have trillions of dollars in assets under management globally. The issue is how do we get these trillions of dollars to go into infrastructure, to go into health, to go into agriculture, to go into financing digital infrastructure that our continent needs very, very well. And so for these, I think to optimize it, we need to do 3 things. First, we need to work with together IMF, ourselves, and the global assets under management, pension funds, sovereign wealth funds, to de-risk their investment in infrastructure. I think that's fundamental. The reason why they don't do it is because they think the risk of it is too high. Second, we know that in Africa we have an infrastructure gap of $68 billion to $108 billion a year. But if we are able to have infrastructure as an asset class in which the global pension funds and sovereign wealth funds can invest, that is nothing. We can really do the infrastructure job very, very well. And that also means that in Africa we have to make sure that the pension funds and sovereign wealth funds see infrastructure as an asset class. And that is where we as a financial institution can really do quite a lot with regard to that. And the last thing that I want to say with regard to this is we need to do better coordination. The chief economist, acting chief economist, talked about the work we're doing with the IMF. I'm working very, very closely with IMF. And I'll use this to come back to the issue of debt. We, as our part of the global financial architecture, have to work, and we continue to work, improving local capacity, improving domestic resource mobilization, improving macroeconomic and fiscal stabilization of our countries. I think, Professor Rama, you have, what's the name of your academy? The Africa Public Financial Academy, that will allow us to build the capacity of countries to actually manage their public finances and to reduce the level of fiscal deficits that they have. So when we play that role at this level in Africa, we complement the IMF at the global level in terms of macroeconomic and fiscal stabilization. So we are all working in sync. We are not competing. And I think this is very, very important. So I'll end by actually saying what Professor Jeffrey Sachs said. For the global financial architecture to work very, very well, and for regional development banks to play the role they should play on the ground, they actually need, guess what? More capital. They need more financing to be able to do that. So there is an issue with how we capitalize appropriately, the right capitalization of the regional development banks to play the role that they play. But it's not just that. We as regional development banks are working for the African Development Bank, for example. We are working to see how we also optimize our balance sheet to make sure that we stretch our resources well. You know, we are today investing quite a lot on synthetic securitization that allows us to take some of our assets off our books, public books, private books, and to transfer some of those to the private sector. That's a way in which we leverage our assets. So I think the issue of proper capitalization of multilateral development banks, in particular the regional development banks, it's important. I think we need to collaborate a lot more in terms of what we do. But on the macroeconomic and on the fiscal side, we need to coordinate better with the IMF so that we can manage the debt issues and so on. But then we have to make sure that the sum must be, the outcome must be greater than the sum of its parts, which means IMF, my dear sister, is doing a great job there, Kristalina Georgieva. We work together, focusing on macroeconomic stabilization, make sure fiscal stabilization is done, but we have the resources to support African development, sectoral development. It's when you have those things working together, I think then you have a real optimization of the global financial architecture for accelerating what it takes to achieve the Sustainable Development Goals.
Thank you, Dr. Additioner, for a very, very robust response there. If I could distill the essence of what you've just shared with us, again, we live in a global village. And in a global village, we all need to work together. You've talked about optimizing the global financial architecture through partnerships, global and regional approaches to development, seats and voices at the table that allow us to have enhanced complementarity and coordination, which requires, again, a global and a regional approach to the issues that we face in our global village. Thank you very much for that, Dr. Additioner. Very much appreciated. I'm going to give both yourself, Madam Kaba, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs an opportunity to provide us with your closing comments on the Macroeconomic Performance Outlook Report. Essentially, how do we overcome some of the challenges that we've talked about here, and any other thing that you'd like to add in just a few minutes, and we'll close. I'll start first with Madam Kaba, and then come to Professor Jeffrey Sachs, and then close with Dr. Additioner. Over to you, Madam.
Merci de...
Thank you for giving me the floor once again. Let me once again underscore the importance of this report for us. In my previous statement, there is something I didn't emphasize about, which is the impact of climate on our people. We are agricultural countries. It is true that states have to work to improve and mitigate the impact of climate change on the population and their income, and also pay particular attention to the putting in place at the international level all the mechanisms that ensure solidarity in a win-win situation. I would also like to mention the support of our partners, because during the crisis, our partners showed a lot of solidarity. Of course, the ADB played its role to the hilt, and even in periods of turbulence, this support has to be continued and even strengthened. I have heard what Dr. Adeshina has said. I am also pleading that you have more resources to further assist us. Generally, states are always asking for donor dialogue, as we refer to it. It is important for donors to coordinate their interventions in our countries. While we plan the economic policy for a few years with the African Development Bank, we plan our interventions over a period of 3 years. With the World Bank, we plan over a given period. We have our National Development Plan, which has pillars, and the relations between the state and the donor is linked to various sectors. And in Africa, there is a lot of work to be done. You have issues covering all the sectors. We need to tackle all the sectors without exception. And I want to mention, as a top priority, education. Education is important for everyone. And of course, the African Development Bank has to be at the core of supporting our countries. I would also like to mention the sub-regional and even continental dimension of all of this. The report underscores this. It is important that Africans coordinate and strengthen their trade. In the medium term, I think the future of Africa hinges on increased trade, because if we want to develop the first markets that are accessible to our processed products will be the African market. So we are placing a lot of hope in the continental free trade area, in the development of connectivity infrastructure between our regions, and while the continental free trade becomes effective, our sub-regional bodies should function as best as possible. In any case, thank you for this quality report and for involving me in its launch.
Thank you very much, Madam Niali Kaba. Again, a call for coordinated integration and trade, particularly given the penchant these days for value addition, which is what really will accelerate economic growth and development on the continent. The needs obviously are great for Cote d'Ivoire and for Africa, and you do have a number of issues that you're focusing on sectorally, particularly with regards to the impact of climate on your agro-based economy, as well as the need to upscale in the area of education. The solidarity of partners, including the African Development Bank, is highly appreciated, and we wish you, again, all the very best, as well as Cote d'Ivoire. I'm going to come to Professor Jeffrey Sachs again for your closing comments and thoughts in New York. Over to you, Professor.
Thank you very much. Let me just underscore a couple of the very important points that President Adesina made. First, the importance of regional projects interconnecting the African regions, especially with transport, digital, and energy. That's a unique role for the African Development Bank. There are some very important projects to undertake. They are financeable. They will have a huge economic as well as social return, but they're transboundary. And I think that this is extremely important. Second, the voice of Africa in the international institutions. One basic idea that I am promoting as strongly is that Africa becomes the 21st member of what is now the G20. The European Union has a seat. The African Union should have a seat. It's simple, in my view. The European Union is 450 million people. The African Union is 1.4 billion people. It's time for the G20 to become the G21 with the African Union. That would open up a lot of opportunities to make breakthroughs on the financing side. Third quick point, yes, leverage the SDRs through the African Development Bank. As the president said, you get a 4-to-1 leveraging. It's a no-brainer. This is really important for us to push this year. Finally, to clarify on the debt, the gross debt to GDP is 60 to 70%. The net debt, lower. But the real problem is many African countries are paying 10% interest rates, 12% interest rates, even higher in some cases. That's untenable. And the maturities are very short. And what the African Development Bank makes possible is long-term, stable, low-interest financing using the AAA rating. And that's why bolstering the flows through the African Development Bank is such a wise and smart move that would tremendously accelerate Africa's development. So again, I agree on all of those points and believe that we're at the cusp of a major sustained acceleration of investment-led growth in Africa.
Thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs. And we look forward to you using your voice, your influence, and your networks to ensure that the African Union indeed does become the 21st member of the G20. Thank you very much for that very, very salient point, because if you don't have a seat at the table, you obviously cannot have a voice at the table when critical decisions are being made. I'm going to leave the last, but certainly not the least, to Dr. Adesina for his final comments as we bring this particular session, our panel discussion, to a close. Dr. Adesina, over to you for your closing comments.
Thank you very much, Victor. I just want to close by first and foremost thanking Professor Jeffrey Sachs for joining us today. And thank you for all of what you said. I think the critical things that you said about Africa's growth rate, 7%, is what you expect that we will have, 7 to 10% by 2023 to 2063. It's that kind of sustained growth that is very, very important. And I just want to make a comment that we are not, as good as 3.8% or 4% is when you have global growth rate of 2.7 and 3.2, 2023, 2024, that's fine. But you see, we must recognize that we are behind the rest of the world. And therefore, our growth must be accelerated. We need 7, 10%, double-digit growth for a sustained period of time if we are going to be able to drive down poverty. I always say that Africa should not become a museum of poverty. We have to make sure that we are supporting macroeconomic stability. We are supporting fiscal policy reforms that will allow us to have the resources at scale for accelerated development of Africa. I am not satisfied with 4% growth. I am not satisfied with 6% growth. We need to have double digit for a long period of time. As Professor Jeffrey Sachs said, if we are going to actually see Africa become that global player that Africa really should be. It's a good start, but we have to set our ambition that we must go to double digits over a longer period of time. I also want to say that on the point that Professor Jeffrey Sachs said on this issue of debt, I just want to make 2 points. One is to thank the shareholders of the African Development Bank. We just had our replenishment of the African Development Fund. And many of you are here, my executive directors are here representing their shareholder countries. Many of the other ambassadors of the countries are here. I want to thank you for that, because we were able to raise $8.9 billion, which is the highest we have ever raised for the African Development Fund in the history of the fund since it was established more than 50 years ago. So please clap for our shareholders, and then we need to leverage all of that to have more resources. And it's a good opportunity for me to also thank the deputies of the African Development Fund for agreeing that we can have a conversation at our board now on how we use the equity we have in the African Development Fund to further leverage capital on the global capital, financing of the global capital markets, exactly what Professor Jeffrey Sachs was saying, at a lower interest rate, long-term money to support the development, accelerated development of these very fragile, low-income countries, which are the ADF countries. We call them African Development Fund countries. So it's a great opportunity for me to make a pitch to my board of directors, they're all here, for their support of that, because with $25 billion in equity that we have in the African Development Fund, if that fund is rated, and we did a shadow discussion of what a shadow rating may look like for it, it probably will be a AAA rated financial institution, Jeff, just like the African Development Bank window is. If that is the case, then we can actually raise on the global capital market about $33 billion of additional financing to accelerate the development of these low-income countries, the ADF countries. So I just want to say that that will help them significantly, and we did our own analysis that actually shows, Jeff, that if those countries that have gone to the global capital markets, the Eurobonds and all of those things, had actually borrowed those monies from the African Development Fund at the rate, even the bank at the rate, we will have probably saved themselves more than $20 billion in interest payments, which is what you were basically talking about, Jeff. So I think the issue of capital adequacy for the African Development Bank, for the other multilateral development banks, and it's very, very important to us to be able to leverage more capital on the global capital markets. We realize the amount of resources is a lot. And it's not just us, the bank, that will do all that. We have to work, and we are working very closely in more partnerships, strategic partnerships with multilaterals, strategic partnerships with bilateral institutions. Very, very important. But most importantly, we have to leverage private capital. I can't say that enough. Private capital is what we really need to leverage a lot more of. So a lot of what we said, Madam Governor, in this report about improving macroeconomic environment, improving the fiscal environment, managing your debt properly, investing in policy reforms, as Professor Rama said, digitalization, e-governance, tax administration, all those things that are really well explained in this report are things that will make the investment environment attractive to be able to attract private capital. I'm very big on the issue of private capital, and I think we need to do a lot more. The other thing that I want to say is we don't eat numbers of GDP. GDP is fine. It's a gross domestic product, the value of goods and services produced in an economy. But people don't eat. In fact, some people even think, if you go out, I'm an economist, you go out and talk to people with GDP, some people think it's actually a political party, a political party or something. They don't understand what it is, right? People don't eat it. So I'm just trying to use that to make a point that what's important is how the GDP growth rate translates into impacts on the lives of people. So it means, therefore, Professor Orama, as we continue our work in the rest of the bank, we have to look at distributional issues. In fact, how does the GDP affect rich countries, higher income countries, lower income countries, and what are the impacts directly on the lives of people? This is why I want to make a pitch that we continue our work on structural transformation of African economies. That structural transformation is crucial. Diversify our economies. Make sure that we have value addition for everything, minerals, metals, oil and gas, whatever things that we have to add value to every single thing that we have. We have to make sure we are investing more in infrastructure. The African Development Bank is investing in a lot of infrastructure, and we should continue to do more on infrastructure. I think to get the 7 to 10% that Professor Jeffrey Sachs is talking about, we also have to take advantage of new opportunities. Green transition, energy transition, provides enormous opportunities for Africa, and we should tap into that. The last two things I want to say, maybe three things. First, also, is regional trade that Madam Minister, the governor, talked about. We need to invest and make sure the Africa Continental Free Trade Area is not just a trading area. Look, we've been trading forever. But if you are trading maize to me, and I'm trading sorghum to you, we are going to be very poor together in a very efficient way without tariffs and non-tariff barriers, because you are trading at the very bottom of the value chain. And my pitch is that to get what Professor Jeffrey Sachs was saying to us, that we have the ambition, is that the Africa Continental Free Trade Area must be an industrial manufacturing zone. And that's what Professor Rama was talking about, industrial policies, wherein we manufacture high value added products. Whether it is the North American Free Trade Area, or whether it's the ASEAN area, whatever it is, every time you have free trade area, they prosper because they trade in value-added industrial products. So we must industrialize. It's one of our high fives of the bank, industrialize Africa. That is fundamental if we are going to spur a greater thing. And lastly, when I was talking about distributional issues, we have not showed you in this report what is happening to the young people on the continent. We have not showed you what is happening in terms of women. I think we need to focus a lot on these distributional issues. Unemployment rates way too high. I just gave a lecture yesterday about education, which I sent to a function in Nigeria. And I was just amazed when I was just preparing for that, how low the social and private returns to education in Africa really are. And so why would people invest in human capital to do the fourth industrial revolution, all the things that Professor Orama talked about, if we are not able to create jobs? So we got to focus more on making sure that this GDP growth creates jobs for our young people. Instead of, they're not going to Europe and they're not going to the United States and not running all over the place. I'm all for orderly, migration. But disorderly migration out of distress, it brings shame to us as Africans. We must have a continent that is growing sufficiently high, able to create quality and decent jobs, to keep its youth population on this continent thriving. That's what we should do. We're not there yet, but that's what we have to do. Make sure that we are growing faster, we are growing well-quality growth, and we have distributional issues, and we are able to keep our young people on this continent thriving. That's the only way we develop with pride. And if I may just end, what can we do without governments? Nothing. In the beginning, Professor Orama mentioned that. And thank you very much, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, for what you said about Africa's place at the table. And I think it's part of what you were saying, what I was saying of the global financial architecture, or global institutions, multilateralism more generally. We need to be more represented there. And I think President Joe Biden mentioned this in the US-Africa Summit, which is fantastic, for Africa to have a seat at the G20, yes. But also Africa should have a permanent seat, or more permanent, more than one, at the United Nations Security Council, where these issues of development are raised. So our voice and our participation is important. But I want to thank the African governments, and Professor Orama said it, despite, and Professor Jeffrey has said it, despite all, against all odds, high interest rate environment, COVID-19 challenges, we have a situation with global conflict, geopolitical risks. We have our own security issues, that Madam Kaba said, in the country. Debt issues, lower commodity prices, volatilities, all those things. In spite of all, Africa still was able to keep its head above water, higher than the global average. You know, I learned how to swim, not only when I became president of the bank. And I learned to swim as a risk management strategy, because I didn't want the president of the bank to go and drown somewhere. And when I learned how to swim, the first thing I was told is, keep your head above water. Then you can swim better. I think Africa, from this report, is keeping its head above water. It can get air, it can move more, but it needs to do more. And we need, therefore, to support our African governments to do more. We need to build capacity of our African governments. We need to help them to expand their fiscal space. We need to help them, as Madam Kaba, the Minister of Finance, do their work on fiscal consolidation. As Professor Jack Trisak said, we need to work globally to make sure that African countries, I still come back to this, Jeff, and I know you agree with me, that I think we are running up a hill with a backpack of sand on our back. And we can't succeed with that. So I really do think we need to make the global debt management issue for Africa better. Jeff, I was just looking recently, I looked at the yield curves. We were talking about the yield curves of Africa have moved up. The interest rates have gone up. You look at the basis points. I was looking at this report. They have, I think it's the Professor Orama, the situation for, I think it's Nigeria, it's about 600 basis points in terms of yield spread. We have Egypt, the minister, the ambassador is here, it's about almost 700 basis point spread. But you look at Ghana, 1,500 basis point spread. And so there's something, as Professor Sachs said, we need to make sure that the Africa risk issue, that Africa risk premium is addressed. Why are we borrowing capital at a very, very high rate? And secondly, how do we, when we run global macroeconomic policies, monetary tightening that you brilliantly explained in your report, has global consequences? Because Africa has a lot of debt, and then the amount of servicing of that debt continues to go up. So we need to look at that. And therefore, I want to commend the Professor Orama and your team to please continue the work on public financial management. We need to keep the debt levels down. We need to increase domestic resource mobilization. We need more private sector, and we need more global finance. In the end, this report will have just been a bland report if you are not here. If you are not sitting here for us to present the report to you, and I hope that this report has shown you the challenges of Africa in the midst of a global set of crises, and how Africa is, regardless of that, still keeping its head above water. I would like to thank all those that have joined us from around the world. You have listened to our story. If there is a message that I want to leave you as I wrap up this session, have faith in Africa, have confidence in Africa, and Africa will continue, with the support of the African Development Bank, to do the right things macroeconomically, right things fiscally,
And those are the things that will make sure that our pace of development picks up to what Professor Jeffrey Sachs said. Why not 7 to 10%? That's le défi, Madame le Gouverneur.
That's the challenge.
Walking. Keep our head above the water. I'm sure we'll swim across the pool. Thank you very much for being here.
Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, thank you very much. Against all odds, Africa remains remarkably resilient with its head above the water. Thank you for joining us to remain in faith and with great confidence that the bank and other institutions will do the right thing to move the agenda of Africa forward, and again for reminding us that we are behind the rest of the world. As the saying goes, the future was yesterday and we are already late. You've enumerated the need for us to grow at double digits, and I just want to thank yourself, Madam Kaba, and Professor Jeffrey Sachs for supporting us with ways, with insights on how this can be accomplished. On that note, kindly give once again a warm round of applause to our distinguished panelists, Her Excellency, Madam Niale Kaba, Ivory Coast Minister for Planning and Development, global development expert and renowned economist, Professor Jeffrey Sachs, joining us from New York this morning, and to our very own Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, President of the African Development Bank, and indeed Africa's Optimist-in-Chief. Thank you for your contributions, your thoughts, your projections, and your insights. Thank you very much. Kindly stay where you are, and at this point, I'm going to call on the to provide reflections of the board of the African Development Bank on the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance and Outlook Report. I would like to call on, at this point, the Executive Director and Chairperson of ECAM, the ECAM Committee at the African Development Bank Group, Executive Director Takaki Nomoto, to provide reflections. The podium is yours.
Thank you very much for this very precious opportunity for me to provide remarks at this very great event. And firstly, I'd like to thank Professor Jeffrey Sachs and Minister Kaba and all other contributors to this event, and also all the participants physically and virtually. And also, as board member, I also really thank President Adesina and Kevin Urama and all the staffs related with this event. And then, now I would like to want to make 3 points. But here, this is my reflection. I try to be aligned with other colleagues, but essentially this is my point. But I try to represent all the board members. So firstly, we are very positive and of course welcome this launch report. And then, as President Adesina said, we also proud of this report. So in my view, there's not enough report on African economy with sufficient frequency and with sufficient country breakdowns. So there's many reports, economic report, but many of it is annual or without country breaks. So as a premier bank in Africa and as one of the major MDBs, I think providing with this frequency of this report is very meaningful. So and also here, I note that the report should be very neutral in the sense that discussion should be backed by evidence. And then now, this report is referring both of the risks and the positive side, so this is very balanced. But still, here I just want to say that I see the role of FDB to highlight kind of more positive side of Africa. I see the tendency for market to see more on the risks on Africa rather than positive side. So if we can show that kind of things with evidence, I think this is really meaningful. Also country breaks, if country breaks can sufficiently highlight the kind of varieties in Africa, that is also very important. And the other thing is actually, if we can highlight or demonstrates that how normal African economy is. Say like I'm from Japan, and then like in 1990s or 1980s, Japan was thought as kind of unique and the standard economic theory doesn't apply, but this is not true. And I see some similarity for African situation now. Say like this report refers to the high inflation. Say like if we just see, some might naively attribute this to the weak governance, but this is of course not true. As discussed, it can be passed through. It can be larger shares of food in a consumption basket. Also, like more structurally, it can be about the low productivity of agriculture, as discussed. And then so through these kind of things, like if we can disseminate some kind of very actual, realistic perspective and observation on African economy, I think that can be meaningful. So in this sense, I really welcome this. And here, I would like to really echo Kevin's point that the importance of coming to Africa. I really see from experience with my Japanese friends and colleagues that people who come to Africa see a lot of chance in Africa, and the people who doesn't come to Africa actually sees a lot of risks in Africa. So like to break down kind of stereotype, I think it's really important for us to bring a lot of people to Africa to see the chance. So secondly, we really care about what this report can work for African development. So like how we can use this report is a kind of major discussion at the ECAM, at the committee yesterday. And then like one can be said, like as discussed, we can use this as a dissemination to investors in non-African regions. And then the granular information this can provide may help their decisions. And also, I want the FDB team to learn more from investors what kind of information gaps they face. So if we can properly address those things, I think we can facilitate more. This report can facilitate more for the African investment. And then within Africa, probably as we discussed, this can be very helpful to enhance the quality of policy dialogue with regional members. So this one I don't go into detail because we fully discussed. And then lastly, as a third point, I want to emphasize that as a board member, we are really open to any suggestions to improve this report. Also, more collaboration with other stakeholders, including governments and academics and the private sectors, and then and with other development partners. So I'm already benefited a lot from the rich discussion so far, and I'm really looking forward to the further discussion by the panelists. So with these 3 points, I want to close my remarks. Thanks very much.
Thank you very much. Reflections from the African Development Bank's Board of Directors, as presented by Executive Director Takaki Nomoto, the chairperson of the ECAM committee. Thank you very much again for reminding us of the need to break down stereotypes and shape the narrative on Africa through the showcasing of evidence. Thank you very much. We're going to take a few interventions, very, very quick. We had previously provided those who were providing interventions with 3 minutes each. I'm going to ask that you kindly distill the essence of your interventions to 2 minutes. I'm going to start first by calling on Mrs. Asome Aminata Diatta, the former Minister of Trade and SMEs of the Republic of Senegal. Over to you, Madam, for a 2-minute intervention.
Merci. Merci.
Thank you very much. Excellency Minister Niale Kaba, Minister of Planning and Development of Côte d'Ivoire, Dr. Adeshina, President of the AFDB, Professor Sachs, and dear panelists. I I'm delighted to take part of this facilitated discussion during the launch of the Macroeconomics Performance and Outlook report for Africa. It's a crucially important document for governments, but also private sector and development partners. I would like, therefore, to congratulate the bank for this high-quality document. So drawing lessons from these prospects and performance analysis, that it's important to draw lessons from the past. And I commend also the optimism of Dr. Adeshina, but I think that there's urgency for us currently for us to act. The history of our continent has shown that Africa has consistently been vulnerable to shocks. Since the 60s, we have had such shocks, which very often lead to disastrous consequences. So it was following shocks that we moved to structural adjustments and whose effects we're all familiar with. So yes, we need to harness the potential of our continent. So this potential is real. We have achieved a major milestone with the African Free Trade Zone, but we do not see it only as a way to overcome obstacles, but we need to really strengthen our private sector, because it's the private sector that will enable it to become operational. It will enable us to indeed meet and achieve the goals and the objectives of the AFCFTA. I think that we also need to draw on the potential of the sector of services across the continent. We do not do this often enough. Some of our countries have been able have seen their jobs go primarily from agriculture to service sector, and the industrialization sector has not really grown. So we need, therefore, to leverage the service sector to grow, to harness our potential, but also to improve the quality of the products that we manufacture. And so with a specific focus on the manufacturing sector. These services have made it possible to expedite the development of the agricultural sector. So and it is my view that we do not sufficiently leverage services to develop agriculture, when services can make it possible to accelerate agricultural output. It enables the retention of populations in rural areas. So in many African countries, and to take the example of Senegal, many young people leave villages to go to cities and towns when there is so much potential for agricultural development and output transformation. But in the absence of resources and given the shortage of equipment for transformation, these youth prefer to go to cities. So the potential of agriculture could really be strengthened and heightened through the services sector. So we can do this, and once again, I would like to commend the team who drafted this very good report. We need, I think, to encourage and to push Africa even further to move forward. We need to find solutions. We shouldn't be we shouldn't go through crises and then forget the lessons drawn, because this only leads to and not go through the same mistakes in subsequent crises. We've been doing this since the 70s. We need for this to change. So thank you all, Mr. President, Minister Kaba, also Vice President Urama. Thank you very much for involving me in this panel. Thank you.
Madam Asome Aminata Diatta, thank you very much for joining us from Dakar, Senegal. Thank you very much for your intervention and insights. Next, we have joining us online Professor Ibiajai of the Department of Economics, the University of Ibadan in Nigeria. Professor, if you're online, you're up next.
Well, thank you very much, Mr. Moderator. Let me start by congratulating the President of the African Development Group for this wonderful day when this maiden issue is launched. I am personally very glad to be in this group and associate myself with the goodwill and the goodness and the high degree of optimism we have been shown by the President as well as the Chief Economist. I think what is important to stress is that Africa is the continent to watch out for in the future. And that is very important. If we can try to put all our acts together by utilizing the abundant resources which we all do have, and do them very well. There is no doubt in my mind that Africa will need a lot of resources. And the question to ask is, how can Africa get all these resources in order to fast track its development? And I'm glad that the President touched upon that. Now, no doubt we have been affected by a lot of external shocks, which is making policy making very difficult for a lot of us and so on. Basically, the emphasis, of course, is to have the skill to be able to anticipate these shocks and put in place remedial measures to mitigate the negative effects of such shocks. Now, a lot of African economies, of course, don't have the personal technical skill to take care of this before the arrival of these shocks. But inevitably, African Development Bank is doing well by putting up this public finance management academy that can, provide skills to economies and countries that need them at the appropriate time. I think that is very useful and should be pursued with the vigor that it deserves. Also, I have taken cognizance of the fact that there is need for African countries to trade. And that has been emphasized by the economists, also the President of the African Development Bank, and so on. But luckily, Africa has the African Free Trade Area. And I think what we do know, there's a lot of work already done about the potentials of that unit, and at the same time, the benefits that can be derived thereon. But I think the answer to it is that African countries and their leaders must now begin to walk the talk. And that is the only way we can have improvement in trading between us and derive the necessary advantage from thereof. Now, it is very clear that there's a high degree of heterogeneity, either in development pattern of a number of countries or the outcome, the macroeconomic outcome. All of them, of course, are based on the individual macroeconomic policy that they put in place. And for those countries, 5 regions that the report talks about, things are not exactly the same because of the kind of policies which they put in place. In other words, we do not have one size fits all. It is very important to maintain macroeconomic stability in order to be able to derive the needed advantage with regards to growth and so on. But you see, growth is more meaningful when it touches on the lives of the people. In other words, the idea of having investment and all of that is to ensure that you improve the living standards of a lot of people. And one of the ways to do so when you have investment, you want to be able to create jobs so that a lot of people are employed and So definitely in my mind, this is true that Africa, if it puts its hands together, can grow in a very substantial way at the rate of 70% above for a considerable length of time before you can begin to talk about poverty reduction in a number of all these countries. Now, talking of comparative advantage, I've always tried to tell people that there is need for agro-allied industry, the development of, because there is empirical evidence that in most cases, the rate of growth of an economy may be dependent on the manufacturing sector of that economy. This is true not only for industry, it's true for agriculture and so on. So there is need to emphasize that I noticed that a lot of attention is being paid by the African Development Bank and some other institutions to agricultural development in Africa. And I think, in my view, this should be pursued with the necessary vigor that you need in order to achieve the objective of not only sustainable growth, but at the same time, an improvement in the welfare of people who live in Africa. On that note, I don't want to overspend my 3 minutes. I have a lot of things to say, but a lot of them have been said by various people. So I think it's better to stop now. Thank you very much, Mr. Moderator, for allowing me to put my input into this. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Professor Ibi Ajayi, thank you very much. As the saying goes, brevity is the spice of life. So for reasons of time, I'm going to kindly ask that the remaining interventions be limited to 3 minutes each. If it is possible to distill the essence of at least 3 points within your 3 minutes, that would be very much appreciated. So I'm going to call at this point on Mr. Johan Krino, an independent consultant and former director of the South African Treasury, to provide us a perspective and insight from his end, particularly as it relates to your region. Over to you, Mr. Krino.
Thank you very much for this opportunity. I hope you can hear me well. Climate change is very real. I mean, it's extremely hot day in South Africa here, but nonetheless, I will focus on two things in my short intervention, on interest rates and currencies. And I think those are the key factors that will reduce cost very much of doing business in Africa. So the cost factor is really something that we need to address. The perceptions out there is most of our credit risk spreads, the credit risk spreads that's added to our currency are driven by perceptions. So how do we reduce that perceptions? I mean, we heard this morning the very positive news of, and I fully agree what's been discussed this morning, of the resilience of our growth story, and also the fact that that there's a lot of positives and focus and directions that's been provided today on how we take how we're going forward. So, but one thing that I really, as a former debt manager, I think we need to start communicating this good news story to the rest of the world, because that is the only way that we're going to sort of have an impact, immediate impact in terms of reducing costs going forward. In terms of I also fully support the African Development Bank as a vehicle through which we can channel investment into Africa, but we should not forget that the deep pocket still lies in your development of your debt capital markets, your local debt capital markets in Africa, maybe per country or per region. It's very important that we don't forget that the real pockets, the real deep pockets, our debt, local debt currency market. And then lastly, challenging private sector be part of this growth stories and the financing from the private sector and how they can play a role quickly. I mean, the private sector needs to be part and parcel of the solutions in terms of our struggling SOEs. The state-owned entities are considered as a vehicle for delivering services. So how can private sector play a role in delivering those services? Again, just to conclude then, It's the human nature that, and I read that this morning, it's the human nature that thinks problems will disappear on its own. It's only through hard work, dedication, motivation, maintaining momentum, and providing direction and leadership that we will achieve our goals. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much, Mr. Johan Kwina. Thank you for your thoughts on the asymmetry of perspective and the need to communicate a whole lot better and much more effectively a lot of the positive development taking place on the continent, as well as the need to roll up the sleeves and move forward. Next intervention will come all the way from Tunisia, from Dr. Hakim Ben Hamouda, who is the former finance minister of Tunisia. Dr. Hamouda, over to you. Do we have Dr. Hamouda on the line?
Yes.
Okay, we can hear you, Doctor. Over to you.
Yes, good morning.
We can hear you. Over to you.
Yes. Merci beaucoup et je voulais, Monsieur le Président, de la part de Dr. Adesina, Madame la Ministre.
Thank you. I will very briefly make 3 comments. Let me start by thanking the President for organizing this very important ceremony on the macroeconomic situation of the continent. As I said earlier, I have 3 points to make with you. There are a number of things to be said, a lot of which has been said already. First of all, let me congratulate the ADB and the chief economist and his team for this high-quality report. This quality makes it possible for us to have the state of play of the macroeconomic situation in a very clear manner. It is a necessary report, and the fact that it is being done biannually allows us to monitor the macroeconomic situation of our continent. And the proposal I would like to make to the ADB, to the Chief Economist Complex, is to continue this work with the countries, because I think it is important that this analysis, this macroeconomic analysis, should lead to technical assistance to countries so that the countries can have the internal capacity to look at its macroeconomic situation. You know, I think the ministers of finance and the economic policy makers should have a dashboard that allows them to have a snapshot of the macroeconomic situation of their country on a day-to-day basis and make the necessary adjustment in terms of their monetary policy, in terms of their budget policy. So you need to continue this exercise. In the second phase, you also it should also lead to support to African countries and regional member countries so that they can have the analytical capacity and the capacity to analyze their own macroeconomic situations. This should also lead to a dialogue between, in terms of the analysis and of the ADB and the analysis made at national and regional level by the REX, you know, because that way you will have a more granular reading of the macroeconomic situation on the continent. So this is a very important piece of work. You need to continue and extend it to cover all countries. My second comment has to do with one of the main findings of this work, which is the resiliency of Africa vis-a-vis 2 major shocks, COVID-19 and then the economic and financial impact of the war in Ukraine. You know, very very few countries, I should say, were able to mitigate these or handle these shocks, but the report has highlighted the capacity of African countries to resist these two shocks and a level of resilience which shows the importance of the private sector as an engine of growth and the importance of the efforts made by the state and also the importance of the support lent by the ADB to all the countries on the continent with a growth of about 3.8%. You know, this is a very, this is an outstanding achievement. It is higher than global rate and makes Africa the best performer among emerging countries in terms of growth. So my third point has to do with something that all the previous speakers have mentioned this morning. It has to do with some concerns, which is, first of all, the level of inflation, which impacts the most vulnerable segments of the population, and which kind of reverses the progress that has been made. Poverty has increased as a result of inflation. And as you said, we note the difficulties of economic policies and macro and monetary policies. You know, African central banks have tried to control inflation, but we have seen the limits of these policies and these choices, which is explained by an important aspect which Dr. Adesina mentioned, namely the limited supply. And I think the answer to reply cannot be ad hoc. It has to be structured, and it has to be one that promotes the structural transformation of the continent and the economies of the continent. Of course, ad hoc spending is important. Ad hoc solutions help, but I think the primary response is to pursue the structural transformation of the economies of the continent. We can no longer hear the speaker.
It looks like we've lost Dr. Amoda there, but we want to thank you for those very insightful points. May I kindly crave the indulgence of the next three interventions that we have, the speakers. The Honorable Minister of Planning for Cote d'Ivoire, Madame Niale Kaba, does have a previous engagement that she has to go to. So we're trying to keep things precisely to the amount of time allocated. It may be helpful if you do not repeat what has already been articulated by in other interventions in order to save time. So I'm going to ask that we kindly and strictly keep the interventions to 3 minutes maximum. Thank you very much. I do apologize that we do have to move things along very quickly. We're followed by a media conference that will take place immediately after this in here. So again, to all of our delegates so far for your interventions, thank you very much. I'm going to go now to Morocco, where we have Mr. Mohamed Boussaid, a consultant and former Minister of the Economy and Finance, online. Again, over to you for your interventions this afternoon. Thank you very much. Mr. Boussaid.
Merci beaucoup.
Thank you. Thank you very much. I'm going to be quite brief, as you have requested. Let me thank President Adesina for his leadership at the ADB, Mr. Urama and his team for the excellent work and this wonderful report they have produced. One reflection and two comments. The reflection is that I fully agree with what previous speakers have said, particularly President Adesina, to the effect that Africa is witnessing growth that is above the global average, and that this growth is weak, but that there is room for this growth to grow to 7% and even 10%, because that is the only way we can create decent jobs for the youth of our continent. And also, this growth has to be sustained over several years, and it has to be quality growth. It is not just growth for the sake of growth. This growth should have an impact on the life of our citizens, of our people on the continent. Two comments. As said by Dr. Adeshina, the biggest investment our continent can make is in its men and women, investing in its youth. And that is before harnessing its natural resources. I think the biggest natural resource the continent has is its population. How do you invest in human capital, in education, in health, in education in general, in training, vocational training, so that these young people can be part of global growth and also increase intra-African economic ties. My second remark is something that has been said already, but I think it is something that deserves our attention, which is the geopolitical risk facing the African and the global economies. We know that there are countries that have gone through a positive growth and development, but which overnight witness the wiping out of the achievements of the past, wiped out by conflict. So we need to adequately target and manage this risk of conflict so that we can consolidate growth. My last point, I strongly believe in regional integration. This has been said before. I don't think that any country, in spite of all the efforts, no matter how good its economic policies may be, a country alone cannot succeed. They say to go far, you cannot go alone. So you cannot go far with your own resources alone. So we need to integrate our continent economically, socially. This is fundamental if we want to have inclusive growth, if we want to have sustained growth. So thank you very much for your attention. Thank you, Professor Adeshina, Dr. Adeshina. Thank you, Professor Urama, for this opportunity.
Thank you very much, Mr. Bosaid, very much appreciated. And now over to Michigan State University, where we have Professor Adesoji Adelaja, the John A. Hanna Distinguished Professor in Land Policy Online, ready with his intervention. Professor Adelaja, over to you.
Thank you. First, let me thank the African Development Bank for the opportunity to comment on this new macroeconomic performance and outlook reporting framework. Of course, President Adeshina, the Honorable Minister Kaba, Professor Sachs, Professor Urama, and other previous speakers have fully captured the importance and essence of this landmark report. So what I will try to do is just to provide a little bit of historical perspective to really show how important what was unveiled today is to the African continent. As this maiden report correctly identifies, Africa's economic environment is changing rapidly. The factors which we generally ignored or considered to be largely extraneous have now become key determinants of growth and performance for many African countries. In this new environment, we need more current and timely information to undergird policies and strategies for Africa's economic transformation. And the African Development Bank has again stepped up the continent's act by implementing this new framework. And I'm excited about the fact that leaders and planners now have more current, more timely information on which to base their economic interventions, their policies, and so on and so forth. And therein lies the value proposition of this report. I wanted to go back a little bit in history and go back to the last 30, 40 years. Following the independence of many African countries, people wondered what was going on in Africa, where this economy is even viable at all. However, the period from 2000 to 2016 was a pivotal one, and Africa actually surprised the world by featuring some of the fastest growing economies in the world. This was not only unprecedented or reassuring. Unfortunately, that growth has been slowed down by a confluence of shocks and stressors, including climate change, conflict, and macroeconomic related factors. Then came the pandemic, and then the Ukraine war. So the point I'm making is that the previous annual report or outlook reporting structure no longer provide deep enough insights to macroeconomic managers, and certainly not on a timely fashion. I like this new approach, twice a year, beginning of the year, later part of the year. It provides more real-time information to policymakers, development partners, and even domestic investors. I read through it, the abstract, growth projections, well detailed, data on long-term economic and short-term economic indicators, growth constraints for different levels of countries, different types of countries, even at the granular level of countries, right? It considers global demand, the disparate financial conditions of countries, changing trade dynamics, and various governance issues. Even identifies key risks and accentuates the policies and reforms that are needed to anchor growth and development. So in a nutshell, what this report means for African countries is more timely and relevant information base for planning for growth and development. And again, let me close by saying kudos to the African Development Bank for providing this timely reporting framework. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Professor Adilaje, joining us from Michigan State University. To your point, particularly about, or rather your commendation of the release of this report early in January and then the mid-year report, I'd also like to point out that it is really to the credit of the African Development Bank that the 2023 Macroeconomic Performance Outlook Report is the first regional report to be released globally of any other institution and any other region. And I think that really calls for a round of applause here. But thank you very much, Professor Adilaje, for that commendation. I'm going to go to our last delegate to provide, again, a brief 3-minute intervention, and that's Mr. Seth Terkper, who is a consultant, an independent consultant, and a former Minister of Finance and Economic Planning in Ghana. Mr. Terkper, over to you. Your final thoughts. Take it home. Do we have Mr. Terkper on the line? Is that a yes or is that a no? Going? Well, on that note, it does look like we do not have Mr. Terkper on the line. If you are, we do apologize for the technical glitches that may have warranted you not being able to join us, but thank you all the same if you're online. I'd like to say a very, very big thank you to all our distinguished panelists, to Professor Jeff Sachs, to Madam Niale Kaba, and Dr. Akinwumi Adesina, as well as our delegates for your very insightful and thought-provoking reflections and interventions. Once again, ladies and gentlemen, can you kindly give our panelists and our delegates a warm round of applause? And for you, members of the diplomatic community, members of the board, delegates and guests who have joined us live in the studio and others online, I think the greater applause goes to you. So if you could also give yourselves a warm round of applause. My name is Victor Oladukunle, and it's been a wonderful pleasure being a part of this morning. Thank you very much. Have a wonderful day. This brings us to the close of this part of the launch of the report, by which will be followed by a press conference with Dr. Adishna and Madam Niali Kaba. Thank you very much once again for your participation and your attendance. Have a wonderful day. Thank you. Okay, yeah, please let him know. Okay. Professor Sachs will also be joining us for the press conference. Professor Sachs, I believe you're still online, so we will have you joining the conference. Yes, please hang with us. We'll be coming to you shortly.
Oh, this is crazy.